Good morning, Jeremy.
Now today, Henry David Stewart. Where do we start with Henry?
Well, I suppose that perhaps we start with when he came to Warrnambool, which was as a 9-year-old child. He came from Launceston with his mother and a sister in the very early days of the town settlement. So he was one of the people that perhaps lived almost all his life here. And because he worked in building agricultural machinery and delivery things and so forth, he really probably had a pretty big influence. I mean, the economy now depends so much on agriculture and the rain that we've been getting over the last few weeks.
Yes.
But even more so than before businesses were set up quite to the same degree. So, you know, he played quite an important role in providing those things that the farmers needed.
Right.
There was a suggestion that his father was a convict, and he came, as I said, with his mother and his sister. So that perhaps may have been something that wasn't discussed much then, but it's a bit of a badge of honour now.
To be a convict, yes.
Yeah, that's right. So he became an apprentice to a coach building builder, and he eventually became a foreman in the firm of Jones and Co. And they were multifaceted, of course, as all the businesses had to be in those days. And they had blacksmiths and wheelwrights and millwrights and agricultural implement makers and machinists. So they all were fairly handy in what they do and became quite skilled tradesmen.
And all sort of lost arts these days, I would imagine.
Yes, yes. They would have had a very practical way of dealing with almost any issue because, of course, there was nothing to fall back on and no place to perhaps buy new goods.
You couldn't just Google the answer, could you?
No. No. So in his early 20s, he did have a bit of an upsetting experience. He saw one of his friends drown in the Merri River, and he was swimming with friends in February 1859 in the Merri, about a mile from the town. So they were swimming across the river. William Sheville disappeared underneath the water, and despite them trying to save him, he died, and the verdict was an accidental death. So that's not a particularly pleasant experience for a young guy.
No.
But eventually, in the 1870s, he set up his own business in Fairy Street, and that was in the building about where the tyre service is in the Fairy Street, in the top end between Liebig and Lava. And in 1871, he had the contract for the woodworking of the lighthouse that was relocated from Middle Island to Merri Street to the Flagstaff Hill site.
Right, okay.
So that's quite an interesting thing for him to have done. That was a significant... In some way, it's almost a piece of public art in Warrnambool, isn't it? Even though it has a practical use, it's something that's on our skyline that most people are familiar with. So he was the person who rebuilt that after it came from Middle Island. So he certainly was a man of many talents because he also operated the West End dining room in Fairy Street, and he provided meals and accommodation to boarders and visitors. And I haven't been able to find out quite where that is, but I would presume it might have been quite near his coach building business or his carriage factory in Fairy Street.
Sounds like something from the 60s, doesn't it? The West End dining room. Laminax tables and, sort of racy waitresses and maybe not.
Yeah, possibly not in that era.
No.
But it is an interesting... I think the West End referred to its location.
Right,
because, of course, we look at Fairy Street as being absolutely central now.
Right,
in those very early days.
For the town limits, probably.
Yes, absolutely. So it is something that's very hard to sort of put yourself back into to that era. And so he did work with his, we went into partnership with George King, and then he eventually joined Andrew Hamlin, and they operated a factory in Lava Street, and that factory actually became later Bruce and McClure perhaps some of the older... No, I can see you shaking your head. You're not that old.
No, I'm not that old. No, sorry.
I can remember Bruce and McClure. Then became Owens of Warrnambool.
Right.
Now it's George Taylor's store.
Right.
Now we're getting...
Now we know where we are. Right. Yes.
So, of course, in those days, there was no car park behind it. There were actually houses in the middle of that block that would have made... Oh, yes, until quite recently. Well, quite recently in my life. There were houses in the middle of that block. There would be many people who'd be listening to your show who'd remember that.
Who might have lived in them, perhaps.
Yes, I think that Billy Bruce was someone I can recall used to live in there, and he must have obviously had some connection with the Bruce and McClure business that was running there. But in 1883, they made the first ever lorry constructed in Warrnambool.
Right.
Now, this might sort of seem... perhaps not important, but, it was a fair move forward. Obviously he was a bit of an innovator, and this lorry was set on springs with a seat raised above on a bit of a platform and had a locking gear for the back wheels, so that would have enabled
been handy.
Yes. Yeah. And it was built for Frederick West of the Winslow Tannery, who was quite a gentleman around town, and we've got a lovely photograph at the Historical Society of Frederick Best of the Winslow Tannery. But they used 2 horses to work the vehicle. So it obviously was something that moved things forward quite a bit. But, he did things like supplying the new gas tank for the gasworks, and that was quite an achievement considering that their other tenders came from Geelong and Melbourne. So not only did he have the skills to do it, but he had the business acumen to actually... do it at a good price and still continue to make money. But at that stage, he was then using steam power, and he was the first coach building trade to do that. And he had a sort of a shafting thing at the back of his shop where he raised water from a well 70 feet deep, which would also be something that would be...
So presumably that well might still be there, would it?
Could possibly be. Now, that would be... If we see a car disappear in the Coles car park, we may
It's not a sinkhole, it's an old well.
That's right. Yes. So he did continue on working till quite a late age. He continued working almost to his death at the age of 84. So that was in 1921. So it certainly wasn't a cushy retirement scheme for Henry. He worked hard pretty much all his life, which was... I suppose that he was a contributor, but he also had some sadness in his life as well. Yeah. He married Jane Simpson in 1860, and they had 3 children. They all died in the first 2 months of their life. This is a familiar story with the early settlers in town, and he married again in 1865 after his first wife died at the age of 22. And their child that they had died at the age of 8 months, and there's no record of any other children. So he had a quiet life, and his contributions were to charitable works. He was a member of the Building Society, Villiers Building Society, very strong in the Congregational Church, and a member of the Masonic Lodge. But he was a fine type of a citizen, and he was closely associated with the development of Warrnambool in the 19th and earlier 20th century.
Yeah, indeed. So well deserving of his place on the board, unlike some of the other people we've come across so far.
Yes, hard worker right to the end.
Indeed. Lovely. Glenys, thanks again very much.
Thank you, Jeremy.